Hello, I'm Paige Gott, and I'm going to provide an overview of our mycotoxin survey for the 2025 crop year for U.S. corn grain. This year for our survey, we have 357 samples that were submitted to date, representing 22 different states. The majority of the samples, 82%, were sourced from Midwestern states, as outlined in the map in green. All of the samples were screened for a panel of 18 metabolites at Romer Labs in Union, Missouri, using the LC-MS-MS technique. Specific details related to the limits of detection and limits of quantitation for the different metabolites are presented in this table. It's important to note that the survey only includes samples that were submitted for surveillance and does not include any samples that were submitted following clinical signs observed on farm. And the lab enhanced some of their methodology late in 2023, so that might affect some of our historical comparisons, as many of the limits of detection were shifted lower at that time. So now we're able to find more of the toxins at lower concentrations than in our historical results. This graph represents the occurrence trends and for the survey. Up the y-axis, we have the primary y-axis, we have the number of samples analyzed in a log scale, which also corresponds to the gray bars and the red shaded numerals across the top of the graph. We had the years of the survey across the x-axis, and then up the secondary y-axis, we have the percent of samples that were positive for the different types of mycotoxins that are represented by the different colored lines. We have aflatoxins represented by the pink line towards the bottom of the graph, type A trichothecenes represented by the light blue line, also across the bottom of the graph. That includes metabolites such as T2 toxin and HT2 toxin, among others. The dark green line that really extends across the top of the graph represents our type B trichothecenes, which includes deoxynivalenol or vomitoxin and related metabolites. The dark blue line follows the trend for fumonisin positive samples. The purple line through the middle of the graph follows zearalenone occurrence, and then the gold shaded line towards the bottom is representing our ochratoxin A positive samples. As you can see, there's shifts over time and year to year, but generally at the top, our top three most frequently occurring mycotoxins have been historically our type B trichothecenes, fumonisins, and zearalenone, and that's no different this year. What we're seeing most frequently in our data set would be zearalenone in 78% of samples, up from 73% positive in our 2024 data set. Similarly, with our fumonisins, we have 77% of samples positive for some level of fumonisin, which is up from 65% of the data set last year. And then finally, in our top three, we have our type B trichothecenes, which were found in some concentration in 76% of the samples, which is up from 70% of the samples being positive last year. As we move down the graph, next we have our type A trichothecenes positive in 16% of samples, same as what we had last year. A slight increase in our aflatoxin positive data set with 6% of samples, up from 5% last year. And then we tend to have very low ochratoxin A occurrence with just 1% of samples positive this year. When we look at the mean of the positives, so out of those samples that tested positive for the respective mycotoxin, what is the average concentration for all those positives? That's represented up the y-axis on a log scale and parts per billion. And then again, we have the years of the survey across the x-axis, and the different colored lines represent the toxin groups that I just mentioned. This year, on average, we're seeing over 3,300 parts per billion of fumonisins, which is up from over 2,900 parts per billion last year and is the highest concentration that we've seen in the last 3 years. We also have more than double the mean concentration of type B trichothecenes this year compared to last year at over 1,100 parts per billion this year. We also have a steep increase in our zearalenone concentration, up to 132 parts per billion on average, which is nearly 3 times what we saw last year at just 45 parts per billion. Our type A trichothecene concentration is very similar to last year at just 39 parts per billion. We have a slight uptick in aflatoxin concentration of 11 parts per billion, and then our one positive ochratoxin A sample was positive for very low concentration at 1 part per billion. When we look at the maximums, we can see those can be very high. This would be representative of one sample that tested at this maximum concentration, just represented over here on the far right-hand side of the graph. Our maximums this year are up compared to what we saw last year for all of the toxins except for our type A trichothecenes. But this year we're seeing much higher concentrations in our maximums, looking at fumonisin at over 51,000 parts per billion, type B trichothecenes at over 12,000 parts per billion, and zearalenone at over 2,000, almost, actually approaching 3,000 parts per billion in our highest contaminated sample. Type A trichothecenes, our maximum this year was 369 parts per billion. Our aflatoxin maximum was 89 parts per billion. And then again, we had just really low concentration of ochratoxin A in our one positive sample. Looking at our maps, this represents our corn risk by state. All the maps will follow the same color scheme in that light gray shaded states we didn't have any samples from. Dark gray shaded states we had samples from, but all of the samples were below the limit of detection for the respective mycotoxin. Our first map here in the upper left-hand corner represents aflatoxins. And then the yellow versus red designations vary map to map as to what the concentration threshold is, but the yellow shaded states are on average below a certain toxin concentration for that type of mycotoxin, and then the red shaded states are on average above a certain threshold, which is represented in the keys for each of the maps. So with our aflatoxin map, the threshold to go from yellow to red is 20 parts per billion, and Texas is our lone state that on average was above 20 parts per billion. If you access the full PDF report for the survey online, you'll be able to get full details for each of these maps. Each map includes a table that breaks down each state. It has the number of samples positive from each state, or the number of samples from each state, the percent of samples positive for the respective mycotoxin, and then that average concentration is broken down by state in the table. In the interest of time, I didn't include all of the maps and all of the information, but there is, again, additional detail in the full report. Moving to the type B trichothecene map, the threshold to go from yellow to red is 1,000 parts per billion. You can see this year our highest concentrations of type B trichothecenes are coming from across the upper Midwest, and then also in some of our plain states, with Nebraska and Kansas being above that threshold on average as well. Moving to the lower left-hand corner, this map represents fumonisins. The threshold here to go from yellow to red is 2,000 parts per billion. And we see our highest concentrations of fumonisins from states that are further south. This is, what we would expect, knowing that fumonisins tend to occur in warmer climates and tend to follow drought conditions. So as we see drought conditions extend north in some years, we do see that threshold, we have more red shaded states and higher concentrations move north. But this year's pretty, I would say, stereotypical as to what we would expect with where our fumonisins come from. And then finally, our zearalenone map, the threshold here to go from yellow to red is 100 parts per billion. Again, similar to our type B trichothecenes, we're seeing higher concentrations on average across the upper Midwest. And again, Nebraska and Kansas seem to be a hot spot for us this year when it comes to several of the mycotoxins that we're seeing high concentrations come out of those states. When we look at the co-occurrence trends, the y-axis here represents the percent of total samples that are positive for the different categories. The green line represents samples that are below the limit of detection for all the mycotoxin metabolites they were screened for. which is 1% of our data set this year, down quite a bit from what we've seen in the past several years. Then our yellow line represents samples positive for just one type of mycotoxin, which you can see runs through the center of the graph. This year we have just 17% of samples positive for one type or one group of mycotoxins. And then our orange shaded line across the top represents samples positive for more than one type of mycotoxin, or co-occurrence or co-contamination is another term that you might hear. This year, we have our highest co-occurrence that we've seen in the history of our US survey, with 83% of samples testing positive for more than one type of mycotoxin. You can see that that's kind of ebbed and flowed over the years, but the last 5 or 6 years, we see a steady increase in our co-occurrence. This could be influenced by the laboratory changes that occurred in late 2023, where we have lowered limits of detection for several of the mycotoxins. So now we're finding them more frequently because we're able to detect those toxins at lower concentrations. So that's likely played into our co-occurrence. But you can see even before those lab methods changed, we were already having that steep increase in co-occurrence. So it's probably more than just an artifact of the lab methodology, if I had to guess. When we break down that data into the specific toxin profiles, so which toxins are we seeing that fit into those categories? Again, we have the percent of total samples on the y-axis, and then those different profiles across the x-axis. The green shaded bar, again, represents those samples below the limit of detection for every metabolite they were screened for. Again, just 1% of our data set. 17% of the samples are positive for just one type of mycotoxin, as indicated by the yellow bars here, similar to what we had with the yellow line on the previous graph. And within that, fumonazins occurred most frequently. 15% of our data set are positive for fumonazins alone. When we look at our co-occurrence, have that split out into the orange bars representing samples positive for 2 toxins, and then the red bars represent samples that are positive for more than 2 types of mycotoxins. That breakdown, so it was 83% overall that have more than one type of mycotoxin. When you split that out, 23% of samples are positive for 2 mycotoxins, and 60% of the total data set are positive for more than 2 types of mycotoxins. Our 2 toxin combination is led by type B trichothecenes, again, vomitoxin and related metabolites, in combination with zearalenone, with 16% of the total data set positive for that combination. And then when we look at our samples positive for more than 2 types of mycotoxins, we have what I like to call the fusarium trifecta, which includes type B trichothecenes, fumonazins, and zearalenone. And 43% of the entire data set were positive for that combination of type B trichothecenes, fumonazins, and zearalenone. So a really high percentage that we have there with the fusarium trifecta. In summary, I'm not going to read over all of this because we just talked through it, and you can read the graph or the charts yourself, but our 2025 US corn data set is represented by 357 corn grain samples submitted from 22 states. 99% of the samples were positive for some type of mycotoxin, and again, 83% of them were positive for more than one category of mycotoxin. In general, we are seeing higher occurrence or percent positive for most of the main mycotoxins in our 2025 data set when we compare to 2024. And we're also seeing higher concentrations on average for most of the toxins than what we saw in the 2024 data set. That includes over 2 times higher mean concentration of type B trichothecenes and nearly 3 times higher mean concentration of zearalenone. So definitely not just finding these toxins more frequently, again with the higher occurrence, but also finding them at higher concentrations when those samples are positive. And again, also that really high co-occurrence. If you're not already signed up for it, please sign up to receive our monthly e-newsletter called The Digest during the months when there's a mycotoxin survey update. So usually 8 to 10 months out of the year, the mycotoxin survey is included in the digest, so you'll get this report right to your inbox so you can access it. Plus, there's other great educational articles included in the digest, as well as company-related updates, which is important as things will be changing quite a bit for us here soon. So that's your best way to stay up to date in all topics related to what we do at the Animal Nutrition and Health Division of dsm-firmenich. You're also more than welcome to reach out to myself or any of my technical team contacts that are listed here. These are the lovely faces behind our mycotoxin reports. So if you're someone who's submitted samples to us, you would have received a report back from myself or one of my colleagues, depending on what species you're working with. And these would be the ladies that are primarily the ones writing those reports and sending those emails out to you. So feel free to reach out to us if you have questions about the survey, or feel free to contact your dsm-firmenich Animal Nutrition and Health account manager if you have any questions. They also know how to get access to the report and help you with any other questions you might have. So thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. Hopefully you learned a little bit about the survey, and please check out the full report because again, it has a lot more details available, especially down to the state level with those maps and the tables on the map pages in that PDF report. Thank you.